While doing research for my previous video, I stumbled upon a positively insane rabbit hole that I knew I couldn't just ignore. Seasteads, or the concept of creating permanent dwellings at sea. Think Waterworld mixed with Bioshock's Rapture. At first glance, it seems like a pretty basic sci-fi technology. Sea levels are rising and 1 in 3 people live within 60 miles of the ocean, so living on the water would definitely save lives and prevent some people from becoming climate refugees. It's also a cheaper, more immediate alternative to creating off-world colonies. It's not like this is a totally new concept either. Since at least the 11th century CE, humans have been creating embankments and levees to reclaim land from seas, lakes, and rivers, which is essentially the precursor to modern seasteading. They both tackle the issue of trying to live where water is, and while land reclamation removes water from an area so we might live on the land beneath it, seasteading cuts out the middleman and sees us just living on the water. There's also the Uru people who live on man-made islands constructed from Totores reeds on Lake Titicaca. According to legend, they migrated from the Amazon to the area by the lake and were oppressed by the local population, unable to secure land of their own, so they created floating islands. Honestly, pretty badass. So there is some historical precedent with manipulating water to make it habitable for humans. Seasteads just bring this concept to its logical conclusion. Where the utter lunacy surrounding this technology begins, however, is with the deranged fanaticism that certain groups of libertarians have for them. They've turned seasteading from an innocuous sci-fi technology that would likely do more good than harm, I hope, into an insane movement whose mission is, rather unsurprisingly knowing libertarians, to escape the evils of government. Their primary goal with seasteads is to create floating nation-states in international waters, where they won't be subject to any other state's sovereignty. Creating new nation-states always seems to be the endgame for a lot of libertarian movements. They want their dumb policies implemented, get salty when their candidates can never win any elections ever, then try to storm off to where there is no government. But then they get upset when they realize there's no terra nullius, unclaimed land, and they can never truly escape Uncle Sam. Every few years, a new libertarian scheme will pop up to circumvent the issue of governments owning all the land on Earth, led by either a mental lightweight who wants to be God King or a professional tax dodger who wants to be a Bond villain. Sealand, the Principality of Islandia, the Republic of Molossia, Liberland, the Free Republic of Verdi. All these unrecognized microstates are nothing more than misguided vanity projects, unrecognized by any member of the United Nations. A few are elaborate jokes, but even the most sincere are never able to gain recognition. Of course, the reason these projects failed was because the land they claimed was already part of another sovereign state, or land embroiled in a border dispute, and for no other reason. None at all. Naturally, the best way to avoid this failure going forward is by building seasteads and establishing them as sovereign microstates on international waters and living out the rest of your days as pirates. To actually reach international waters, you first have to venture 200 nautical miles away from any state's coast. Within 12 nautical miles of the coastline are territorial waters, where a state's sovereignty directly extends. Anything illegal on the mainland is illegal in those waters. The next 12 nautical miles is a state's contiguous zone, which, while not directly subject to its sovereignty, the state can prevent infringement of its customs, fiscal, immigration, or sanitary laws and regulations within its territory or territorial sea within that zone. So still a rather broad jurisdiction. Then the next 176 nautical miles are the state's exclusive economic zone, where they have sovereign rights for the purpose of exploring and exploiting, conserving and managing the natural resources, whether living or non-living, of the waters super adjacent to the seabed, and of the seabed and its subsoil, and with regard to other activities for the economic exploitation and exploration of the zone, such as the production of energy from the water, currents, and winds. Again, rather broad jurisdiction. These 3 distinct zones were created by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which has been in effect since 1994. But surely our friends the Libertarians won't run into any issues with constructing sovereign microstates in the aforementioned zones. However, that begs the question, who are our libertarian friends? Who are the masterminds leading this incredible movement? Well, ladies and germs, may I introduce you to the Seasteading Institute, your premier destination for pragmatic alternatives to conventional governance. The Seasteading Institute was founded in 2008 by Patrick Friedman and Wayne Gramlich, although the institute appears to ignore the latter's contribution, and funded by PayPal co-founder and infamous MAGA libertarian, Mr. Peter, we must redouble the efforts to commercialize space, Thiel, with a cool $500,000 donation. Patrick Friedman, upon being a world-renowned poker player, is also the grandson of Milton Friedman, Nobel laureate in economics and free market bootlicker, who also happens to be one of the most famous economists ever. So famous, in fact, that whenever Patrick Friedman is brought up by a news article, they make sure to mention that he's Milton Friedman's grandson. Patrick Friedman ended up leaving the Institute in 2011 to pursue other libertarian fantasies. Their president and sort of de facto mouthpiece for the movement at large is Mr. Joe Quirk, who joined the Institute in 2014 and is one of the goofiest guys I've ever learned about. Even his name just makes him sound like a snake oil salesman. If someone named Joe Quirk tried to sell me anything, my gut reaction would be to flee. And here's him on the Joe Rogan Experience. I bring up this clip because, rather amusingly, Joe Rogan, who generally supports libertarian candidates and platforms, wasn't particularly interested during their little interview. Mr. Quirk offered Rogan a position on the Seasteading Institute's board, to which Rogan quickly replied that he doesn't have the time.
I'm getting so many ambassador applications right now, I can't keep up with them.
I want to be an ambassador.
Yeah, you.
I think it'd be dope.
You should be. You should serve on our board or something. So imagine
that kind of time.
Honestly, it's just embarrassing that Mr. Quirk couldn't even get Joe Rogan on board with his harebrained scheme. That's how you know you failed as a con man. Anyway, on their own, the Seasteading Institute doesn't do much themselves. They have a donate page where they accept cryptocurrency, which was honestly the tipping point that made me realize I had to make a video on them, and they've run this tremendously geeky seasteading tabletop RPG in the past with an embarrassingly low turnout. For the most part, they assist other projects and companies that are actually the ones making Seasteads while they spread awareness for the movement. This can be seen under their section What We Do. They have a book written by Mr. Quirk, which I unfortunately bought and read, a podcast, some informational videos, and other miscellaneous outreach on Facebook, Reddit, and Discord. They somewhat defensively deflect their inaction by saying, as a non-profit organization, our role is not to build Seasteads ourselves, but to set the stage in order to empower others to do so. Yeah, sure. But you heard them right, they're a non-profit, which means they don't pay income tax, big shocker, and we get access to their tax returns. Doing some quick research, we can find their 2020 return and see that they spent less than $50,000 on programs, development, and fundraising. Or put simply, money spent furthering the seasteading cause, which was less than a fifth of their total expenses of that year. Most were office maintenance and salaries. Oh yeah, Mr. Quirk, for example, made over $90,000 in that same year. Of course, that's including like gifts and bonuses and whatever stuff on top of his base salary, but that's still an obscene amount of money for the very little this organization does. We can also see that they provided no money or grants to any of the organizations they're assisting, which struck me as odd. It's not even because they're a non-profit or anything. Non-profits can donate to for-profit businesses, just as long as that money being donated goes to actually like further the cause of the business. Even still, there are plenty of projects affiliated with the Seasteading Institute that aren't for-profit, all of which receive no donations from the Seasteading Institute that year. And this wasn't just a result of the pandemic either. Their 2019 returns show similarly low expenses for those categories, and again, zero donations to any projects affiliated with the Institute. Mr. Quirk, however, still made a cool $85K. Bless up. Okay, so the Institute is mainly the mouthpiece for the seasteading movement, but why? Why specifically are they so invested in this dream? And most importantly, how are they presenting this concept to the general public? Well, here's their mission statement. At the Seasteading Institute, we believe that experiments are the source of all progress. To find something better, you have to try something new. Today, there is no open space for experimenting with new societies. That's why we work to enable seasteading communities, floating cities, which will allow the next generation of pioneers to peacefully test new ideas for how to live together. This is the main idea behind the seasteading movement, that modern governments fail because they don't experiment enough with different solutions. If we simply allowed more experimentation and governance, we would find better solutions. And to allow this experimentation, we have to create nation-states on the high seas, where no existing state has sovereignty. Except that claim is purposefully vague and nonsensical. What kind of new ideas would they test? Political reform? Greater social liberties? Different tax systems? This concept falls apart upon greater scrutiny because A, any monumental overhaul to how society functions would need a much larger sample size than the, at most, few thousand people you could run the experiment with on a seastead for it to be widely adopted by larger governments, as what works for 5,000 people probably won't work for 5 million. B, any much smaller experiment has likely already been, or could be, tested in a state or local government, and doesn't require a city, state, and international waters to be tested. And C, you're just describing communes. When you ask what these seasteading communities will even look like, a common answer you'll get is them just saying, well, we're gonna find solutions that we can't even imagine right now. We don't know what they'll look like. And then try to draw a parallel between what they're doing and what the founding fathers did with the United States, which is such a cop-out.
It's in principle unimaginable. So if we have 500 seasteads on the ocean, they will produce surprising innovations that I can't possibly imagine. And it's equivalent to monarchists in Europe asking Benjamin Franklin, well, what will Manhattan Island look like? How will it govern itself? Why would it be better than the kingdoms we already have? What are your plans? The only thing he could say is, well, I'm not really sure.
Personally, if I were a proponent for creating a new society, I would be able to tell you how that society would function. And if I were a proponent for creating the ability to create new societies, I would be able to give a few examples of what I expected to see. To do neither is concerning and doesn't help the viewpoint that these seasteads will just be lawless tax havens. When asked if seasteads are just being made to avoid taxes, the Institute doesn't even deny it. Bro, you're not helping your cause. Why would you say this? Anyway, seasteaders like to throw the word discover around a lot too, and whenever they do, I can't tell if they truly think that governments and policies are just arbitrarily made. Society doesn't just randomly try out new ideas of governance. Decisions are based on historical events, data, research, and a society's priorities and values. They're not drawn from a hat. The reason policies that seasteaders want are never implemented is because there's clearly no widespread support for them. The alternative is that seasteaders are trying to undermine the intent and goals of previous governments and obscure how political reform actually occurs, so it becomes less concerning that these seasteaders won't tell us their true ambitions. And that's where I fall with a lot of claims made by these guys. I can't tell if they're dumb or if they're trying to deceive dumb people. Hanlon's razor tells us to never attribute malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity, which I'm inclined to listen to, but I'm not entirely convinced. Now that we understand why seasteading is necessary, because governments are unwilling to experiment with how they govern, we need to know how seasteading will operate. Alright, get ready for this doozy of a phrase. The free market of governance. Yes, there is no way that could possibly be a bad idea. The best way to test out a lot of crazy ideas is by having a market of governance, where residents are the customers and the governing are companies. Because seasteads are innately transportable, if you don't like your government, you can vote with your house and move to another government that you do like. As such, governments will naturally adopt highly favorable policies in order to attract citizens. Seasteaders dislike current governments not just because they're unwilling to try new ideas on a whim, but also because they monopolize governance. Yeah, I don't know if you were aware, but governments have a monopoly on government, and the only way to fix that is by introducing a startup sector for governance. This way, you and your allies can link up and create your own floating governance provider. These are all real quotes, by the way.
A startup sector for governance. And people can vote with their houses. We could replace monopolies on government with a market of governance. Link up with your allies and found your own floating governance provider.
If you turn your brain off, this sounds like a good idea. Government is bitch after all, and having the option to change governments sounds swag. Of course, using any amount of critical thinking inevitably leads to the conclusion that this is an awful idea. Ignoring the fact that you can already change governments by moving to either another state, for my America heads, or abroad, and that changing governments in the seastead world would likely be as difficult as it is in our world, as you'd have to get a new job, say goodbye to your friends and family, get settled in the new place you're moving to, etc. Trusting the free market with something as integral as government is unfathomably stupid. See, without any government intervention, a market economy eventually destroys competition, which in turn is its defining attribute. As a company becomes the dominant player in an industry, it has the leverage to shut out smaller companies, either through acquisitions or by undercutting prices until these smaller companies have to close shop. It doesn't matter if that smaller company has a better service or product, it simply won't have the capital to keep up with the dominant companies. And if they do have a better service or product, they'll be poached by the mega corporations who dominate that industry, in turn giving that corporation even more leverage in the market. You can see it in our own world. Most industries are run by a handful of companies. Disney, Comcast, AT&T, and Paramount Global control the media. I don't know how to say that in a non-like New World Order conspiracy way, but they do. They do just kind of control the media. They control everything. They're media conglomerates. I don't know. I'm just spitting facts. I'm just saying the truth, man. Don't hate me. Yeah, those four control the media. The Coca-Cola company and PepsiCo control the soft drink market. Equivalent parallels, I know. Alphabet Inc., Meta, Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft control the American tech industry. Airbus, SE, and Boeing control the commercial aircraft market. The list goes on. Any industry you look at, there will be less than a half dozen companies that dominate it. And they dominate it to such a comical degree that no one would even consider starting a new company to rival them. Imagine trying to make an e-commerce platform to compete with Amazon. It would be impossible without a gargantuan investment from another mega corporation. There's a reason that the only US auto manufacturer to go public in the last 60 years was funded by the co-founder of PayPal, whose daddy had an apartheid emerald mine. In our current economic system, you can't break into an industry without an insane amount of capital. So if we take governance and turn it into a service and a market economy, what would happen? Well, initially, there'll probably be a few dozen startup governments, as everyone wants to try their hand in this burgeoning industry. Some will go belly up, as not everyone is cut out to make it in business, and the residents of those failed governments will flock to the more successful ones. As time progresses, some governments will create really great policies, some more will fail, and more residents consolidate into fewer and fewer governments. At this point, startup governments are having less success, as no one wants to leave behind what they know to go live in some random new government. But if those startup governments have a good governance model, they might be bought out by the bigger ones. More time progresses and more people continue to flock to the increasingly large governments. Now there's only 3 left. One of them makes some new policy that a portion of their residents don't like, and that group tries to secede. Vote with your house, right? Well, that government doesn't want them seceding, because they're concerned if word gets out that that's an option, more people will secede and they'll lose influence. So the government has the dissidents either imprisoned or executed. Alright, that's a little grim. So suppose the dissidents do secede and create a new government. Then what? They lack the resources to create a government that can compete with the big 3, and even if they have the resources, what's stopping the big 3 from invading and annexing or destroying them? The big 3's goal, being in a market economy, is to maximize profit after all. If some competitor is threatening that profit, it's in their best interest to eliminate them, peacefully or otherwise. In the end, we'll wind up back at square one. There will be a handful of governments monopolizing governance and nothing will have changed. Except now we're in the ocean for some reason. Ever the intellectual, Mr. Quirk counters my logic and reasoning, and ever so smugly says, "Yes, but what about cruise ships?" I reply, "Yes, what about them?" About to destroy my entire career, Mr. Quirk says,
"A captain on a cruise ship is, in practice, a dictator of his own mobile island."
This line of reasoning is the greatest indicator of how Mr. Quirk thinks. He claims that because the captain of a cruise ship is completely in charge and doesn't immediately become corrupted by their power, that means the free market of governance is smart and makes sense. He questions why, with all that power, they don't beat and kill their passengers and crew. The answer, he reasons, must be because if the captain did that, no one would want to take a cruise on their ship, and their crew and passengers would move on to another cruise line. Ergo, the free market alone saves cruise ship passengers from their utterly psychotic captains. Once again, any amount of critical thinking shows why this is not the case. Cruise ship captains, while being in charge of their ships, still answer to the cruise lines they work for, which will obviously fire them if they start beating their passengers and crew. So they refrain from doing that, not due to any set of moral beliefs, but to not get fired. To put it in a way Mr. Quirk would understand, the captains are looking to maximize their profit, which will be negatively impacted if they become unemployed. Also, even in international waters, ships are still under the jurisdiction of their flag state, which is the state where the ship is registered. So the captains can't go on a murderous rampage because they'll still be charged in the courts of the state the ship is registered in. Honestly, it's telling that Mr. Quirk can't identify the larger systems at play in his analogies. He made a video discussing how dictatorships can't happen on Seasteads because people can just leave, and because no one would choose to live in a dictatorship.
If you have North Korea, those people have no choice. If North Korea could disassemble and people could move their homes to South Korea, it's very difficult for a tyrant to get a foothold in a place where it can detach and move away.
But seemingly is unable to identify how dictatorships come to be in the first place. There's force involved. You can't just leave because you'll be killed. How can you vote with your house if the Seastead dictator sinks your house with a torpedo? In our world, defecting from oppressive governments such as North Korea, or historically the Eastern Bloc, is famously difficult because their government doesn't want people to leave. And in our world, it's theoretically easier to defect because traditional states don't have the same mobility that Seasteads have. If you defect from a Seastead, what's to stop that Seastead from pursuing you? I could go on, but I hope you understand that the free market of governance is very much a bad idea. The book I mentioned earlier, Seasteading, How Floating Nations Will Restore the Environment, Enrich the Poor, Cure the Sick, and Liberate Humanity from Politicians, which is an insane title, is written by Mr. Quirk with Patry Friedman. I couldn't find anything that said how involved Friedman was in writing this book, but I'd be willing to bet it wasn't much. Considering the book wasn't published until 2017, and Friedman left the Seasteading Institute in 2011, 3 years before Mr. Quirk joined, I'd say odds are slim to none that he had any substantial involvement. Him being associated with the book was likely just a marketing ploy to garner more attention, as Friedman is more famous than Mr. Quirk, but that's just my theory. In any case, the book kinda sucks. Mr. Quirk isn't a very good author, and the book offers no cohesion to his claims. Each chapter is just a bunch of somewhat related essays, although I hesitate to even use that word. They're all broken up by a heading, and none of them are more than a couple pages. This gives the book absolutely no flow. One thought is explained for a few paragraphs, then abruptly ends so we can read a new thought, which rarely expands upon the previous one. And because none of these thoughts are related, we constantly need context for them, which results in the reader being bombarded with a million names, dates, and figures that are relevant for one page before never being referenced again. The whole book is like this. It's choppy and there's no narrative, by which I mean he doesn't build off his ideas to give a comprehensive look at Seasteads. It's just a bunch of unorganized thoughts. And while we've already gone over most of them, there are of course some bangers worth mentioning. Naturally, you have just incorrect information, such as claiming a state's exclusive economic zone doesn't apply to the surface waters, which it absolutely does. You also have historical misunderstandings, such as claiming the United Nations is unambiguously on the side of self-determination. Considering the UN's famously wishy-washy position on both Taiwan and Palestine, they are very much ambiguously on the side of self-determination. Mr. Quirk also cites sources in absolutely the worst way I've ever seen in any book ever. Instead of having footnotes with sources at the bottom of the page or at the end of the chapter, he has this huge 41-page notes section at the end of the book with all his citations. Except the citations are listed chronologically and there's no indication in the text that something is being cited, so you have to look over the page numbers in the notes section to find what sources are being used where. This makes it needlessly difficult to discern the credibility of his sources while reading the text, which might be intentional. But over 10% of the book is dedicated to citations, which is just wasteful. Okay, here's a quote for you. Brilliant people are generating exciting modern ideas for how to solve old governance problems at a profit. I like this one a lot because it once again ousts Mr. Quirk and his perspective on government. To him, governments are businesses whose primary reason for being is to increase profits, which he correlates to be GDP, gross domestic product. The summation of a state's government spending, consumption of goods, investment, and the difference in profit between exports and imports in any given year. Yeah, I took intro to macroeconomics in college. Who's asking? Anyway, this is why Mr. Quirk is always talking about how island nations have increased their GDP in the past 30 years or whatever. He views that as the nation succeeding. He doesn't care about political freedom or social liberty or even wealth inequality. So long as that nation has a big GDP, it's succeeding. Anytime he critiques a government, it's always one with a low GDP that happens to be oppressive, like Venezuela, North Korea, or a state caught up in some war. But he's not critical because the government is oppressive, it's because their economy is bad. An oppressive government with a high GDP, like China, Russia, or Saudi Arabia, is not bad in his eyes because they have a strong economy. Mr. Quirk seemingly doesn't recognize that a government's purpose is to protect and care for its citizens. He rarely brings up social policies because he doesn't view that as a government's function, and instead focuses on tax codes. This is why he views governments as monopolies, because he thinks taxes just get sucked into the aether and aren't used to fund public services. To him, it's protection money he has to pay the government or be put in jail. He wants Seasteads to succeed so that either he can get away from taxes or to be the one sucking them into the aether. Governments, nor any service in the public sector for that matter, should be driven by profits. They exist to serve the public, and as long as they do that and can be paid for, they don't need to be making a profit. At a profit is also a concerning phrase in that quote, because who is the one making a profit in these seasteads? Is it the person who owns it? It certainly isn't the people living on them, and if the person in charge is making a profit, they're no better than the kings of history. My point in all of this is that governments won't succeed if profits are their motivation. That will just fuel corruption, generate greater wealth inequality, and create ineffective governing bodies. There's a little Q&A section in the book, and one of the questions is, what if seasteads exploit the poor? And instead of explaining how seasteads will eliminate this issue, Mr. Quirk responds, if life is better and they choose it freely, then we have empowered the poor, not exploited them. I shouldn't have to tell you that this is a positively insane take. You can marginally improve someone's life while still exploiting them. When sweatshops move into a new country, the jobs they offer are still exploitative even if they improve the lives of the people working in them somewhat. Or take a look at like migrant farmers in California. Those jobs are still exploitative even if the migrants are willingly taking them. A running trend throughout this Q&A section, and the entire book at large to a certain degree, is that Mr. Quirk won't actually have answers to rather important questions. One is about rogue waves and if seasteads could survive them. Mr. Quirk answers, just don't build seasteads where rogue waves happen. Yeah, great idea, dickhead. When asked about any sort of political violence that occurs on seasteads, he says, yeah, well this already happens on land, so who cares? Like, bro, that isn't encouraging. You should be telling us why seasteads are better and safer than terrestrial civilization, not admitting it will be as bad, if not worse. I think I would actually prefer if he lied about these things, as that would somehow be more tactful than admitting this thing he wrote an entire book on is actually kinda ass. Regardless, we've covered the whys and hows of seasteading. It's time to see what projects the Seasteading Institute is actually supporting. How close are we to experiencing the free market of governance ourselves? The answer may surprise you. It's not very. We're not very close. Arctide is one company attempting to create seasteads. Their mission is to create a modular floating unit that can be attached to other units, enabling people to come together and form communities in the water, along with researching and developing other technologies that will facilitate life on the sea. They've begun construction on their super tiny coquinas, which are comprised of little 12 by 12 feet modular cubes. Think like real life cube world. You can reserve one for $100,000 and should get it by March of next year. These can basically go wherever you want, although I imagine it would be a real pain in the ass getting the necessary permits to put them in a harbor or marina or something. The wording on the website makes it seem like this company doesn't really know or care what the coquinas are used for, and that this is just a sort of proof of concept stage so that Arctide can undertake larger projects in the future. They want to make their iconic Arc, huge hotels, aquacultural centers, and spaceports. But like they need to prove to investors that they have the technology to actually create these, so they're stuck making teeny tiny boxes for people in the meanwhile. But hey, compared to some of these projects we'll take a look at, I think Arctide has promise. They're not caught up in insane politics and are just a company making a product. Whether or not their seasteads will destroy the ocean is yet to be seen, but considering they are actually in the process of building their products, they're by far the most confident company we'll be looking at. Also, the filter on the CEO and advisors' photographs make them look like Giga Chads. Seabrick is working on creating an interlocking, buoyant brick system composed primarily of kelp biomass and designed to support the marine sector in the journey to decarbonization. Basically concrete, but it's made of kelp, which is what some seasteads foundation will presumably be constructed of. There's no information on when Seabrick will be available or even how close it is to being built, and their LinkedIn page only lists 2 employees. Spooky. Ocean Builders is one of the funniest companies we'll be looking at today. They're also making seasteads, but they call theirs sea pods. Little dinky Jetsons-esque pods that just jut out from the ocean. They've built exactly one, which sits in Linton Bay, Panama, and you can pre-order one now for the low price of $995K, or $895 for the economy model. You have to put down a refundable $199 deposit, but in return you'll get an enormous 850 square foot floating apartment in a Panamanian marina. Yeah, these seasteads are not actually gonna be like independent nation states on international waters, they're just expensive houseboats. Literally houseboats. They're flagged as houseboats under Panama maritime regulations. You're literally buying a worse houseboat. A houseboat that can't move. They also sell green pods, which are sea pods but on land, making them an infinitely worse house. But wait a minute, what's the point of sea pods if you still gotta abide by Panamanian law? Isn't the whole draw of this not having to live under the shadow of sovereignty? Well, let me introduce you to Mr. Chad Elwertowski, president of Ocean Builders and the world's first seasteader. Yes sir, back in 2019, he and his girlfriend launched the sea pod prototype off the coast of Thailand and lived in it, proving the viability of this concept. Well, except the Thai government quickly caught wind of his seastead, raided it, and hauled it back to the shore. They charged Elwertowski and his girlfriend with trying to undermine Thailand's sovereignty and attempting to create a new state in Thai waters. Crimes punishable by death. Fortunately, Elwertowski and his girlfriend managed to flee the country before their sea pod was raided and are now wanted by the Thai government. Elwertowski argued that that's not what he was doing and was instead just testing out the sea pod prototype, but the fact stands that the sea pod was launched just 14 nautical miles off Thailand's coast. Yes, that's outside their territorial waters, but still well within Thailand's contiguous zone and exclusive economic zone. You can't just make a permanent dwelling at sea even if it's technically not in territorial waters. The exclusive economic zone gives the state the exclusive rights to the economic exploitation of that zone, which a permanent dwelling absolutely violates. These stupid bastards didn't even bother reading up on maritime law before launching their seastead. Elwertowski also goes like, oh well, the Thai government's a military dictatorship, they're unjustly taking my seastead down, this isn't right.
The way things work in Thailand is it's a military dictatorship, so if they want somebody's giving them trouble, or they think they're giving them trouble, they just take them out. So.
Bro, if you knew the Thai government was a military dictatorship, why did you launch your seastead in Thailand? This is your fault, dickhead! This kind of failure right out the gate doesn't really bode well for the future of seasteads, and might be why Ocean Builders is, at least for the moment, placing their sea pods in marinas. I imagine they don't want their paying customers to be executed by foreign governments, so now they're just making worse houseboats until they can figure out a way to turn them into nation states. That's just my 2 cents though. I could be wrong. Now, the Atlantis Sea Colony is the black sheep of all these projects, as they're the only ones making underwater constructions. Basically, their goal is to develop the technology needed to create underwater seasteads and then become contractors for underwater housing projects or businesses. I actually got to speak with their CEO, Brendan Traxler. I tried reaching out to a bunch of these seasteaders, but he was the only one that got back to me. And honestly, he was a really great guy. He explained that the vision for this project, which he's had since high school, stems from watching old Jacques Cousteau documentaries on PBS and becoming fascinated with scuba diving, in part due to coming from the landlocked state of Illinois. The Atlantis Sea Colony became affiliated with the Seasteading Institute due to both of them pursuing similar goals. Their first step will be to create a proof of concept in some inland body of water, like an old quarry or a lake, before moving on to offshore constructions. According to Traxler, the main thing holding back Atlantis Sea Colony is funding. Also, unlike many of the other projects associated with the Seasteading Institute, Atlantis Sea Colony is not interested in fringe libertarian movements. Traxler thinks that getting caught up in politics before they even have a proof of concept is a surefire way to kill any interest investors might have in their project. He did say that once they develop the technology, people could use it to do whatever they wanted. Traxler is just focused on getting this project off the ground, and like with Arctide, I have some faith in this. He's a chill guy and doesn't appear to be an insane libertarian, which is more than I was expecting. I post my whole conversation with him, but I was so nervous going into it I forgot to record my audio like an asshole. Whoopsie. And yeah, we follow each other on LinkedIn. FlexBase Singapore is focused on making the legitimate sounding, very large floating structures, but their website is down and they have 25 followers on Twitter. Slow goings for them, seems like. Ethos Island is the first fully politically charged project we're looking at. They've broken up the formation of this microstate into 3 distinct phases, which made sense for a bit. The first phase is to garner support online for a few years. In phase 2, they'll buy a marina or port in Florida and have the people who expressed interest in phase 1 live there for a few years just to get accustomed to living together and by the water. Then in phase 3, they just have a modular seastead somehow and they live on it in international waters. Yeah, they kinda lost me at the end, but whatever, maybe in all their build-up they can locate contractors who can build a seastead. The main thing I found interesting was that they actually spell out what their government would look like. They have a charter and explain how the seastead would be paid for and why privatized governance is a good thing actually. Well, a lot of it's dumb and doesn't really make sense, but at least they have a somewhat thought out plan. That's a lot more than half these projects have. Take, for for instance, securing space on the seastead. This process is likened to buying a condominium, which makes enough sense. You want each homeowner to own a part of the seastead, so by purchasing a unit they become a partner in the Seastead Corporation, like how condos work. As a partner, they can contribute to creating rules and overseeing how the seastead is run. Then when you start looking at their charter, you realize there's just these vague personal citizen contracts in the Nation Compact, which promise to protect rights but will not actually be written for a long time. But apparently there's no income tax. Curious that this specifically had to be spelt out when every other right and liberty is just vaguely hinted at. But everyone pays uniform fees. Of course, uniform fees are just a fancy way to say taxes, but shh, don't tell them. They say that Ethos Island will be governed by the principles of natural law, the non-aggression principle, and privatized civic functions, all of which are kindly linked to their Wikipedia pages. And blah blah blah, they promise to figure it out later. Their biggest thing is eliminating politicians and the concept of political class. They plan on doing this by creating both the Nation Compact and personal citizen contracts with all 500 residents present, during some sort of constitutional convention, I suppose, and ensuring that all their civic functions are run by private contractors instead of the government. Still, this just doesn't make sense. Let's reason through it. Everyone who owns a house on the seastead is a partner in the corporation. That corporation, Ethos Island, needs private contractors to take care of waste disposal and road work or whatever. To determine which company will win these private contracts, the partners in the seastead will have to come to a consensus, presumably by voting on which contractors they want to hire. But maybe there's too many partners and not everyone cares enough to be directly involved with every decision, so the corporation decides to create an executive board that will award contracts. But how will this board of executives be selected? By voting? Vote for someone who you think will make the best decisions to run the seastead? My God, you just created both politicians and a representative democracy. It's even dumber when you realize their judiciary body is also privately operated, meaning either the partners or executive board will just be voting for judges. Presumably the cost of these contractors will be split among Ethos Island's partners through the aforementioned uniform fees, which means they'll just be paying taxes. The website also makes the claim that any private contractor that breaks the seastead's rules will be removed, and there will be complete transparency in regard to Ethos Island's finances. But who's gonna remove the contractors? Will the executive board have to vote on it? What if there's an impasse and an obviously corrupt judge is allowed to continue practicing because the board is split 50-50? And to make any changes to Ethos Island's Nation Compact or the personal citizen contracts, one would imagine the partners or board would have to vote on them as well. The point I'm making is that, try as they might to escape taxes and politicians, these seasteaders always end up recreating both. Also, they have a GoFundMe that's raised £5 of £10,000. Not 5,000, 5. Atlas Island is like Ethos Island, but with an uglier website and no actual plan. It reads like a civics homework assignment where you have to make your own nation. They do acknowledge that it will take years until the seastead's sovereignty is actually recognized, so they'll have to abide by the laws of flag states for a while, which kind of defeats the purpose of doing this in the first place, you know? Also, how will you gain sovereignty if your seasteads belong to an existing state? Won't your flag states try to prevent you from seceding? And again, I just giggle whenever I see libertarians accidentally reinvent taxes. They say their goal is to attract liberty-loving, hard-working individuals who are tired of being subjected to excessive taxes and regulations. But they inadvertently create both of those. Each platform within Atlas Island will be operated as a free private city. The relationship between the platform and its residents will be governed by a written resident contract. This contract will detail the services provided by the platform operator and the expectations of the residents, including their user fees. Hey asshole, user fees are just taxes. If you're paying to live in a city that offers free access to services while living there, but need to pay the person who owns the city, you're just paying taxes. Atlas Island is also trying to combine the idea of a free market of governance with the uniform city-state concept of Ethos Island, which just doesn't work. Each platform is a free city, but in addition to the obligations of the resident contract, all platforms will be expected to uphold the core tenets of freedom upon which Atlas Island is based and respect the natural rights of residents. That means there isn't actually a free market of governance because all the platforms in Atlas Island need to abide by certain principles. These certain principles are just regulations. You're in fact regulating the free market of governance, something that supposedly makes your skin crawl. Ventive Floathouse is trying to make seasteads, but theirs look like pills. The website offers no information on when they'll be available, and they haven't tweeted since 2018. I hope they're okay. Freedom Haven is kind of more of the same. They plan on using shipyards to produce the platforms for their seastead, which won't be ready until 2037. Despite that, there's already a constitution written for it. On top of the classic taxation is theft, a quarter of the document is just spent defining what property and freedom means, then painstakingly describing what children can consent to. Gotta love libertarians, man. You can't make this shit up. You can consent to indentured servitude before you can consent to assisted suicide, and 2 14-year-olds can get married, and a 16-year-old can have sex with a 20-year-old, and you can't consent over property until you're 8, which means a kindergartner can't give one of his toys away to a friend because they can't consent to it. This is almost a worthless document. Seastead.ai Limited is making these ugly things. I'd say more, but that would mean I have to navigate this atrocious website. Arc pads are made out of seasteading cement, which is a totally real thing. Supposedly they're going into mass production soon, but who knows if they actually are. And then Arc House is a seastead, but it's a club, like a country club on the ocean. If you want a membership, it's only $7,500. Or if you and your spouse both want to be members, it's only $7,500 for the two of you. Wait, what? Or if you and 3 buds want in, it's only $15,000 for all of you. And look, hot people are supporting this venture. Clearly it's not a scam. They're selling NFTs too. They recently signed the lease in the bay they'll be using and have started producing the club boats, so it looks like this project will be completed in the next few years. I don't think it'll be the next big thing, but will likely just be a scam in the same vein as like Fire Festival, but aimed at rich crypto bros, which is why most of their ambassadors are hot women. There's also the Floating Island project in French Polynesia. Back in 2017, the Seasteading Institute signed a memorandum of understanding with the French Polynesian government, allowing them to construct seasteads in the state's waters, then created the company Blue Waters to manage this construction. The government was interested in the project due to the existential threat that rising sea levels imposes on French Polynesia, and the Seasteading Institute was ready to abuse the government's trust to create a semi-autonomous zone, like Monaco, Hong Kong, or Singapore. For whatever reason, the government didn't want a group of libertarians, whose mission is to eliminate the government, building a floating city on their waters. One TV host in Tahiti, the island closest to where the seastead would be, likened the situation to the Galactic Empire strong-arming the Ewoks, which is such a good analogy. The following year, the French Polynesian government rescinded their agreement, citing tech colonialism. Oh yeah, the whole project was being funded with cryptocurrency, which completely doomed the floating island project. Good on French Polynesia. To this day, the Seasteading Institute is still salty that their scheme was recognized as being utterly worthless to the French Polynesian people and bemoan misinformation or whatever. The last project from the Seasteading Institute we'll be looking at is Blue Seed. This was going to be a repurposed cruise ship sitting in the United States' contiguous zone, which would allow non-US startup entrepreneurs to basically work in the United States without needing a work visa. Whenever they needed to go to land, they could get a business or tourism visa, which I guess is easier to obtain. The reasoning was that because the ship would not be in US territorial waters, everything would be fine, as long as they didn't infringe on the US's customs, fiscal, immigration, or sanitary laws and regulations, which housing undocumented tech bros definitely doesn't do. There's no way the United States, with their famously lenient immigration laws, wouldn't be totally chill about this. I swear none of these people even speak to a lawyer before greenlighting their ideas. Anyway, the project never took off because of a lack of funding, but it's absolutely for the best that it was dead on arrival. A lot of people would be in jail if it succeeded. While these are all the projects that have been associated with the Seasteading Institute, there exist a few other miscellaneous projects that have been attempted over the years that warrant discussion, as this rabbit hole truly has no bottom. The first of these extremely funny boats is the Freedom Ship. Imagine a ship, but it's really big. No, bigger than that. No, even bigger. Okay, not that big. It's a ship, but it's 4,500 feet long, 750 feet wide, 350 feet tall, and has 25 decks. Looking at design mock-ups for it reminds me of the stuff I draw in art class in elementary school. Yeah man, the only thing cooler than a big ship would be an even bigger ship. So what's the deal with the Freedom Ship, huh? What kind of spin on seasteading does it have? Well, honestly, it's just a really big cruise ship that you can live on all the time. It would circumnavigate the world constantly, have giant duty-free shopping malls, schools, hospitals, all the essentials, and you'd just live there. Again, all the designs discussing what the Freedom Ship would look like reads like a grade school project where you have to create a city or something. Oh, it'll have a casino and commercial districts, there'll be attractive artwork and architecture, parks and promenades will boast waterfalls, ponds, and extensive landscaping, and the top deck will be an airport, and there'll be 40,000 residents residents, 20,000 crew members, 30,000 daily visitors, and 10,000 overnight guests. Oh wow, that's really cool. Yeah, isn't it? This project, the brainchild of Norman Nixon, has been in the works since at least the mid-90s, yet is nowhere near completion. Most of this can be attributed to the prohibitively high cost to build it, somewhere around $10 billion. There are also a million other issues with the project that are not addressed at all, like what state the ship will be registered in, how will laws be enforced, what sort of governance will the ship have, how will goods be imported, how will customs work for international tourists visiting the ship, what about rogue waves? All very important questions that need to be answered before you can move 40,000 people into international waters. Rather unfortunately, Norman Nixon died in 2012, before he could see this project completed, which is sad. Out of everything we've looked at, this is by far the most innocuous project. Sure, a lesser man might have turned this into something resembling a Bond villain scheme, but Nixon just wanted to make a really big ship, and I can respect that. The other one worth noting, and arguably the funniest venture we'll be looking at today, was the recent failure of the MS Satoshi. Originally named the Pacific Dawn, the MS Satoshi was a cruise ship purchased by Grant Romont, Rutger Koch, and Chad Elwertowski of Ocean Builders. Yes sir, our boy Chad Elwertowski is back at it again. Nothing can keep this man down. The three of them bought the ship in 2020 for a meager $9.5 million. For reference, it was built in 1991 for $280 million. It was so dang cheap because of how the cruise industry got bodied by COVID. They renamed it the MS Satoshi after Satoshi Nakamoto, the pseudonym of the person or people that invented Bitcoin. It was going to be parked off the shore of Panama and basically just let you mine cryptocurrency without fear of regulations. Except it was just gonna follow Panamanian laws, so like, again, what's the point? What's the point of this? Elwertowski did a Reddit AMA for the MS Satoshi, and a lot of people called him out on this just being a scam. Due to insurance matters, folks couldn't even have a microwave in their rooms. The only cooking appliances on the ship could be in the kitchen, but don't worry, all residents would get a 20% discount for the cafeteria. Cool, dude. Also, no pets that weigh more than 20 pounds. Also, you're just living in a tiny room on a cruise ship. Believe it or not, but no one wanted to move to a tiny room on a ship in Panama where they couldn't cook or bring their dog, all in the name of some Bitcoin mining plan that was not beating the scam allegations. Not only that, but our boys at Ocean Builders didn't even do any research before impulse buying a cruise ship. They thought they could just convince the Panamanian government to just let them keep the ship moored off the coast and have it deregistered as a ship, making it instead a permanent residence. Nope. You can't do that. Also, you can't dump waste into Panama's waters, so they would need to sail into international waters every few weeks to get rid of their poop and pee. Oh, and no one would insure them either, for rather obvious reasons. Instead of doing any soul searching and reflecting on why this plan was failing at every possible step, Romont simply bemoaned that the cruise ship industry was plagued by over-regulation. And so, after sailing halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, our intrepid trio realized they had to sell the ship, literally 2 months after buying it. They docked in Panama and ended up selling the MS Satoshi to Ambassador Cruise Line for $12 million. More than they paid for it, but likely not enough to cover the expenses of running it. Dude, they were blowing $12K on gas every day. Once again, not accepting it was their fault that the MS Satoshi failed, Elwertowski said, "We have lost this round. The new normal, Great Reset gains another victim." Yeah, every time something doesn't go my way, I'm just gonna start blaming the New World Order. Really, this story pisses me off because it's another example of how much money stupid people have access to. If I had $9.5 million to throw around, I would not be making microstates out of cruise ships. And if I was, I would hire lawyers to see if I could, not just winging it, assuming that everything will work out. The same bonehead that almost got killed by the Thai government and wasted damn near $10 million on a whim also once asked why onions and mayonnaise are in everything. What a world. Everything that seasteaders do is beyond frustrating to me because there are legitimate benefits to seasteading. Being able to grow algae everywhere would not only help soak up CO2 from the atmosphere, but provide food and habitats for fish. Being able to relocate a city would allow it to move before an area's fish population is depleted. Being on the ocean allows for essentially limitless tidal power and provides an enormous heat sink for nuclear reactors. There are a lot of perks to living on the ocean, none of which include the free market of governance. All their schemes are centered around creating microstates, which are, in turn, unsubtle talking points promoting tax evasion. Whenever a seasteader talks about how much they love freedom or liberty, they're either talking about not paying taxes or bemoaning regulations we have in place for the most obvious reasons. Yet despite that being their ultimate goal, no taxes and regulations, they try to convince everyone that they're doing this for totally normal and upstanding reasons. On the Seasteading Institute's website is a list of the 8 great moral imperatives, which sounds like something the Nazis would have. They're just vague problems that seasteading can address. Enrich the poor, cure the sick, feed the hungry, clean the atmosphere, restore the oceans, live in balance with nature, power the world, and live in peace. Sure, these are all good, but they're leaving out the selfish things the Seasteading Institute would benefit from seasteading, namely, no taxes. If they were so invested in creating new and innovative ways to self-govern, which is their idea behind their free market of governance talking point, they could just make a commune. Go buy a plot of land in Alaska or something and create a brand new community up there. Look, here's 200,000 acres for $15 million. More expensive than the MS Satoshi, but undeniably more useful. Since all these crypto bros have seemingly infinite money, it shouldn't be hard to just develop land and build a commune up there. Bro, it's the middle of Alaska. I doubt the feds are going to be harassing anyone. Ignore whatever laws and regulations you want. I doubt anyone will stop you. Go make whatever sort of community you desire up there. Create your own rules, see what works. There's no way developing land up there would be harder than creating floating cities. You could experiment with anything you wanted to, although you still have to pay taxes. But all those crazy ideas they're always talking about would be fair game. The fact that no seasteading movement has instead focused their efforts on what I proposed is rather telling, I think. It shows that, above all else, what motivates them is money, or at least avoiding taxes. And if they were just totally upfront about that, I could respect them. It's insane behavior I wouldn't support, but I would at least respect their conviction, you know? But they always try to obscure their motives for escaping the evil clutches of the government, and that's just cowardly. Either that or the Seasteading Institute is being totally sincere, and they're just that dumb. So, is that it? Are all seasteads just doomed to fail? The only one that actually launched was raided by a country's military, and other than that, they're either being sold as worse houseboats, concepts that will never go anywhere, or won't be ready for a decade. Well, no, actually. When you remove Libertarians from the equation, there are 2 seasteading projects that seem pretty viable. OceanX Busan is your standard seasteading affair, although with no libertarian ulterior motives. Instead, it's a coordinated effort between OceanX, the city of Busan, South Korea, and the United Nations Human Settlements Program to create an environmentally conscious city on the water that will serve as a prototype for similar projects going forward. The project was first announced on April 26, 2022, and while there haven't been many updates since then, OceanX Busan appears to be South Korea's selling point for their bid at hosting the 2030 World Expo, so I imagine we'll be hearing more about it in the near future. And honestly, I don't see why this project wouldn't work. It has the backing of a large host city and the United Nations, it's going to connect to the pre-existing city of Busan, so there won't be as many logistical issues as there would be for supplying a seastead 20 miles off the coast, and the floating platforms are going to be on a sheltered lagoon, so exposure to rough storms won't be as much of a problem. But really, the biggest thing OceanX Busan has going for it is being backed by legitimate governing bodies. Because OceanX's interests align with those of South Korea and the United Nations, the only issue that this project will run into is funding or some catastrophic technical failure. Anyway, I have faith in this one. I'm not like particularly invested in seasteads, despite making like a 50-minute video on them, but it would be a cool thing if OceanX builds the first floating neighborhoods, and I generally enjoy having cool things happen, so our interests kind of align there. The other project that even has a remote chance of happening is the Maldives floating city. The Maldives are one of the states that stands to lose the most from rising sea levels. The highest point on any of their islands is less than 8 feet above sea level, and by 2050, nearly 80% of the islands could be underwater. So yeah, a city that can float would benefit the Maldives much more than other states. The company behind this project is Dutch Docklands, self-proclaimed world's leading developer for floating cities, who has partnered with the Maldives government to make this a reality. However, I don't really trust this one. See, the Maldives' largest industry is tourism, which accounts for nearly a third of their economy. And during President Abdullah Yamin's administration from 2013 to 2018, he made it easy for investors to undertake massive infrastructure projects that absolutely wrecked the environment. Extensive land reclamation, developing uninhabited islands, filling in lagoons, all of which assisted in the destruction of the island's coral reefs. Yamine's agenda was a total 180 from his predecessor, Muhammad Hassan, who attempted to make the Maldives the first carbon-neutral state. In a perhaps unsurprising turn, last December Yamine was convicted of money laundering and accepting a bribe, and was sentenced to 11 years in jail and fined 5 million USD. The reason I bring all this up is because no matter how much Dutch Docklands boasts about their dedication to sustainability and embracing a green economy, I can't help but foresee the Maldives floating city becoming just another resort. Sure, it's a much more environmentally conscious resort, but I fear that would just further facilitate tourists squirreling away the natural beauty of the island until the Maldives are nothing more than one glorified resort that the locals have to live on, in the same way that tourism in Hawaii hurts the local people there. The CEO of Dutch Docklands, Paul van de Kamp, says the Maldives floating city will be an amazing place where locals and foreigners can buy their dream property at affordable prices. But I'm hesitant to believe that. Opening up the properties to foreign customers is just asking them to be immediately sold at prices unaffordable to the locals. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong about all this and the Maldives floating city will end up being an incredible development for the Maldives. I just worry that by creating a workaround for the industry that is actively destroying their state, it will be destroyed even faster. And yes, the Maldives government is backing this project, but remember, they also back the other resort projects that killed their coral reefs. Regardless of the repercussions, this one is getting built. It would take some monumental blunder for this one to fail. Supposedly the first residents will be moving in sometime in 2024, but I haven't been able to find any updates on how far along the project is. At any rate, I'd bet dollars to donuts it'll be fully up and running within the next decade. Proving that seasteads are feasible is going to have to be done by large corporations partnering with bureaucrats, not libertarians being backed by crypto millionaires. And I think these two projects are good evidence of that. I have more trust in OceanX Busan than the Maldives floating city, but I'm kind of a UN apologist, so take that as you will. And I find it kind of ironic that the only two projects affiliated with the Seasteading Institute that have any hope of succeeding are the ones that aren't interested in the libertarian cause. Arctide and Atlantis Sea Colony. And even then the latter is struggling to find investors. I genuinely don't believe any of the Seasteading Institute's attempts to create microstates on the high seas will ever succeed. The logistics are never thought through, and the demand for such a product is so much smaller than I think they realize. The MS Satoshi was the closest we ever got to seeing an actual crypto-based seastead. They bought the ship! And even then there wasn't any demand. Even the most die-hard Bitcoin enthusiasts didn't want to live there. Here's one quote from our hero Chad Ewertowski that has stuck with me while going down this insane rabbit hole.
Most people don't actually like liberty.
Most people don't actually like liberty. He came to this conclusion after Ron Paul lost the GOP primary in 2012, and I was dumbfounded by this thought. Ewertowski and his fellow seasteaders are so caught up in their libertarian fantasies that they never stop to wonder why the political philosophy they love so much has no widespread support. No libertarian currently holds a seat in Congress, and there's only a single libertarian that holds office in any state legislature, Jared Samus of Vermont, and that only happened because he switched parties 4 months into his term. Likewise, the only libertarian to ever be in Congress, Justin Amish of Michigan, also only got there by switching parties halfway through his term, after serving as a Republican for 9 years. Instead of perhaps rethinking their political views, they just call everyone else dumb for not loving liberty or whatever. And who knows, maybe we are, but we're not the ones wanted by the Thai government. They have this undying belief in their libertarian aspirations, which continues to hurt their prospects of actually creating seasteads. If they could just tone it down a little and appeal to the greater public, they wouldn't face insurmountable roadblocks at every single step. Seasteads don't even exist yet, and the Institute is already trying to use them for insane fringe political movements. No wonder the technology is received better when you frame it in a more conventional way. Seasteads will allow cities and resorts to exist long after beaches erode and sea levels rise is a much stronger pitch than seasteads will let us create the free market of governance where anyone can create their own microstate. For as much as Mr. Quirk and co. talk about the free market, they really struggle with the whole supply and demand aspect of their own political philosophy. There are some truly bizarre people out there trying to do the impossible and failing at every opportunity. The libertarian dream of humanity living on seasteads will be achieved in the very near future, and it will not be thanks to libertarians. Now, while he was only relevant in the beginning of this rather long tale, Patrick Friedman has a whole other rabbit hole associated with him, just as insane as this one, if not more. If you want me to cover that, or if you just want more of this sort of long-form dunking on libertarians, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Lord knows there's more than enough material. And of course, thank you dear humble patrons for making this video possible. Yep, I have a Patreon now. If you want to see what goes into making one of these videos, stay up to date with the various projects I'm working on, and hear exclusive director's commentary for every video I've ever done, consider supporting the channel. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed going down this enormous rabbit hole with me. Take care.